It was a decision I never thought I'd have to make, cutting ties with my own flesh and blood. But after years of turmoil and heartache, I knew it was the only way to preserve my sanity and my marriage. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Alex, and I'm a 29-year-old software engineer living in Seattle with my wife, Emily. We met in college through mutual friends and hit it off immediately, despite our vastly different upbringings. I was raised as an only child by my parents, who divorced when I was 10. It was an amicable split, and they remained on good terms, but I never felt a particularly strong bond with either of them. They were always wrapped up in their own lives and careers, and I learned to be independent from a young age. Emily, on the other hand, came from a tight-knit family. Her parents had been happily married for over 30 years, and she was the youngest of 4 siblings. The Wilsons were the kind of family that had weekly dinners, went on annual vacations together, and celebrated every milestone with rambunctious gatherings. When Emily and I started dating, I was initially charmed by her family's closeness. But as our relationship progressed, I began to feel like an outsider, constantly struggling to keep up with their intense level of involvement in each other's lives. The real trouble started when Emily's older brother, Jake, went through a rough patch. He had been working as an accountant in Chicago, living far away from the family. But after his wife left him, he fell into a depression and eventually lost his job. Without hesitating, Emily's parents insisted that Jake move back home with them until he got back on his feet. I understood the sentiment, but I didn't anticipate how disruptive this would be for our own lives. Suddenly, Jake was a constant presence in our home. He would show up unannounced, sometimes staying for days at a time. Emily felt obligated to entertain him and keep him company, which meant our nights and weekends were no longer our own. I tried to be understanding at first. Jake was going through a hard time, and family was important to Emily. But as the months dragged on, his overstays became more frequent, and his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would make snide comments about my job, my appearance, and especially my relationship with Emily. "When are you two gonna make it official and get married?" he'd joke, even though Emily and I had been engaged for over a year at that point. The final straw came when Jake showed up at our apartment after a night of heavy drinking, banging on the door until I let him in at 3 a.m. He proceeded to vomit all over our living room before passing out on the couch. I was fuming, but Emily just cleaned up after him, chalking it up to Jake being Jake. That's when I realized this wasn't a phase, it was who Jake fundamentally was. A self-centered, immature leech who would suck Emily dry if she let him. For the sake of my own sanity and our future together, I knew I had to put my foot down, even if it meant driving a wedge between Emily and her family. I tried talking to Emily about setting some boundaries with Jake, but she refused to hear it. In her mind, he was going through a tough time, and we needed to be there for him no matter what. But it was getting to the point where Jake's presence was affecting our own relationship. We stopped going on date nights because Jake would inevitably tag along and kill the romance. Emily and I rarely had any intimate moments because her brother was always camped out in our living room. Weekends that were supposed to be our time together were constantly hijacked by Jake wanting to go bowling or to the movies or out for drinks. The worst part was how dismissive Emily was of my concerns. She made me feel like I was being unreasonable for wanting even a shred of privacy or couples time in our own home. Whenever I brought it up, she would accuse me of not understanding the importance of family. Things came to a head when Jake arrived at our doorstep with a new girlfriend in tow, a promiscuous woman half his age that he'd apparently met at a nightclub. I could tell right away that she was trouble, with her tight clothes and heavy makeup and a personality as subtle as a freight train. Within a week, the new girlfriend had moved all her belongings into our spare bedroom. Emily was fine with this, insisting we just give her a chance. I was at my wit's end. I worked all day at a demanding job, only to come home and find this stranger lounging in my home, helping herself to my food and utilities. I put my foot down and demanded the girlfriend move out, but Emily sided with her brother, saying I was being unreasonably hostile to his new partner. The argument grew heated, with Emily insinuating that I was being selfish and not understanding of her family's needs. In the heat of the moment, I blurted out something I'll never forget. "It's like you married your brother." "Not me." Emily fell silent, stunned by the insult to her loyalty to Jake. She left the apartment and stayed at her parents' place for a week after that. When she finally returned, I could see it in her eyes, the unwavering choice she had made between her husband and her brother. Jake was out of our lives for good. Emily laid down an ultimatum: it was her brother or me. As painful as it was, Jake had to go. His constant boundary crossing and the chaos he brought into our lives was doing irreparable harm to our marriage. To his credit, Jake took it better than I expected when Emily broke the news. There were no screaming matches or emotional breakdowns. He simply packed his few belongings and his girlfriend's things, and they moved out of our place within a couple of days. But the real fallout was between Emily and the rest of her family. Her parents were blindsided and devastated that she had abandoned her brother in his time of need. The tension rippled through the whole Wilson clan, with Emily's siblings also taking sides. For months, Emily didn't speak to her parents or two of her sisters. The family gatherings and weekly dinners stopped altogether. Holidays were minefields that forced Emily to choose between celebrating with me or her childhood family. I could see how much it pained her to be alienated from that close-knit family unit. She tried to put on a brave face, but I knew the feelings of guilt and sadness were weighing her down. Her relationship with her parents became almost irreparably strained. In those first few months after kicking out Jake, there were many nights where Emily would get misty-eyed or sullen over missing another family event or celebration. I did my best to reassure her that we had made the right choice, that Jake's toxic behavior was destroying our lives together. But it was small consolation. Slowly, however, Emily emerged from that dark period. She reconnected with friends from college and former coworkers, building herself a new community beyond just my friend group. We made more couples friends and focused on nurturing our relationship without the black cloud of her brother's antics. It took a couple years, but eventually the hurt and anger faded. Emily made tentative peace with her parents and two of her sisters, though the other two siblings stubbornly refused to let go of their resentment. While the family ties would never be fully restored to their previous closeness, Emily came to accept that it was a necessary sacrifice to preserve her own happiness and sanity. Looking back, as painful as it was, going no contact with Jake was one of the most important steps we took in fortifying our marriage against external stresses. Just when I thought we had put that whole sordid chapter with Jake behind us, life threw us another curveball. About a year after cutting ties with Emily's brother, we received some life-changing news: Emily was pregnant. We were overjoyed at first. Starting a family together was a dream we'd had since getting married. But that initial elation quickly turned to dread when I realized the Pandora's box this could potentially open with Emily's estranged family. Sure enough, as soon as the news got out through the family grapevine, it was like someone broke the dam. Emily's parents were suddenly blowing up her phone. Her sisters were showing up unannounced, desperate to be a part of this new grandchild or niece/nephew's life. I watched as Emily's resolve slowly broke down. As hurt as she was by her family's actions around Jake, she didn't want that rift to impact her child's ability to know their extended family. She started letting her parents and sisters back into our lives, albeit slowly at first. It was a tiptoeing act, carefully allowing them to get glimpses of her pregnancy and the new life growing inside her, while still keeping healthy boundaries. I'll admit, a part of me resented having to deal with her family again after everything we went through. The real crisis happened when Emily went into labor a few weeks before her due date. Her parents and sisters all rushed to the hospital, along with Jake, who I hadn't seen in over a year. It was a chaotic scene: my wife howling in pain, doctors buzzing around, and her overbearing family literally getting in the way and causing a ruckus just outside the delivery room door. Jake even tried barging into the room before a nurse thrown him out. In that moment, with Emily crying out for me amid the pandemonium in the hallway, I snapped. I stormed out of the delivery room and laid into every single one of them. I let all the built-up anger and resentment pour out in a furious tirade about boundaries, respect, and putting Emily's well-being first. The look of shock and shame on their faces told me they realized they had gone too far, overstepping again. One by one, her family members sullenly left the waiting room after my outburst. In the end, it was just Emily's mother who remained, and she was there to support her daughter when our beautiful baby boy was finally born after hours of labor. As Emily cradled our son in her arms, she looked up at me with a smile, and I knew she was grateful I had drawn that line in the sand for us. From that point on, We allowed Emily's family calculated little bits of access, but never again would we sacrifice our family's peace or boundaries for their overbearing desires. Our son grew up knowing his extended family, but without the chaos and strain that nearly tore us apart before he arrived. The years that followed were not without their challenges when it came to navigating Emily's family dynamics. With a child in the picture, it became much harder to completely shut them out, even when their overbearing tendencies would resurface. There were still the occasional flare-ups and reminders of why we had to cut ties with Jake in the first place. Like the time he showed up at our son's 5th birthday party chewing tobacco and getting into a drunken political argument with my father. Or when Emily's sister Jen attempted to mom-shame us for letting our son have too much screen time. But we had learned from that crescendo moment in the hospital delivery room. Emily and I were a united front, gently but firmly enforcing boundaries with her family. We allowed them to be present in our lives and our son's life, but not to the detriment of our core family unity. As our son got older, he naturally started to pick up on the tensions between us and Emily's parents and siblings. We had many open conversations with him, allowing him to process the complicated family dynamics in an age-appropriate way. While he loved his aunts, uncles, and grandparents, he understood that we were his core family unit. To their credit, most of Emily's family made efforts to respectfully course-correct when we called out overstepping behavior. Her parents seemed to realize their past transgressions and made more of an effort to just be gratefully present in the moments, rather than inject themselves too heavily. The same couldn't be said for Jake, however. He remained as clueless and self-absorbed as ever. Numerous times, I had to pull him aside at family gatherings when he became too intoxicated or made inappropriate comments around our son. The final straw came when Jake pulled a paternity joke at our son's high school graduation party, insinuating he wasn't really our child. Emily and I didn't even blink before showing Jake the door that night. Our son, mortified by his uncle's remark, simply nodded in approval as Jake was kicked out of his own party. We realized then that the kid got it. He understood why his uncle was often kept at arm's length. From that point on, Jake kept whatever slivers of contact he had left to infrequent phone calls and group emails. Emily grieved that lack of closeness with her brother, but deep down, she knew he had ultimately chosen that path through his own entitled behavior. As for the rest of her family, we found a healthy balance over the years. They remained part of our extended circle, but we fiercely guarded the healthy boundaries of our immediate family. Our son grew up seeing that dynamic model the importance of family, but also the necessity of protecting your core family's peace. It hasn't been a perfect road, but Emily and I learned that the strength of our marriage and parenthood bond will always take precedence, even over familial ties. I'm just grateful we course-corrected before it was too late. As our son grew into a young man and eventually left for college, Emily and I entered a new phase of our lives together. With an empty nest, we had to rediscover our identities as a couple, apart from being parents. It was both exciting and challenging. On one hand, we had our freedom back. We could travel, pursue hobbies, and be completely selfish with our time in a way we couldn't when raising a child. But it also felt strangely adrift at first, like we had lost that core part of our identity and purpose. Thankfully, we had built a strong foundation over the years of putting our marriage first. We leaned on that as we navigated this new chapter. We took yearly trips to reconnect, just the two of us. We explored new couples' hobbies like golf and wine tasting. And we made more efforts to nurture our extended friend circle beyond just couples with kids. Of course, Emily's family still tried inserting themselves, even without grandchildren to use as an excuse. There were the persistent requests to have us host holiday gatherings since we had an empty nest now. The not-so-subtle questions about when we planned to become grandparents ourselves. And the occasional oversharing from Emily's sisters about their own kids' lives, as if we were starving for that connection. But we had learned well after the Jake saga how to keep them at an appropriate arm's length. We attended family events selectively, never overcommitting ourselves. When the nosiness and unsolicited advice became too much, we simply put those family members on an information diet or faded from the group text chains. To her credit, Emily was unwavering in maintaining those boundaries, even as she missed that closeness at times. She knew from hard-won experience how quickly things could spiral if her family was allowed to encroach too far into our lives again. Watching Emily so confidently and unapologetically put us first was one of the things that made me fall even more deeply in love with her during this phase. After over 20 years together, she was still the woman I had chosen to be my partner. Not long after our son graduated college and settled into his first job, Emily's parents passed away within a year of each other. It was a solemn time, but also one that represented the symbolical closing of a chapter for us. As we memorialized her mother and father, Emily recognized how their well-intentioned but inherently narcissistic parenting had led to such strained family ties. More than mourning their loss, she mourned the lack of depth they had ever allowed into their adult relationships with their own children. It was a harsh reality, but one that Emily emerged from with a newfound wisdom about what truly mattered: the family we had built for ourselves through hard-fought boundaries and mutual respect. In the evenings, as we sat on the porch of our home watching the sunset, I knew Emily had found a deep contentment. Her family relationships were what she chose them to be, not defined by obligations or misguided loyalties. She was at peace with the difficult choices we had made to protect our marriage and our lives. As I looked over at my wife of over 25 years, I felt immensely grateful. Our love had endured the incredible tests thrown our way, and that unshakable bond got us through the darkest, most complicated chapters with Emmy's family in a way that only strengthened our commitment to each other in the end. If only I could go back and cherish those final sunset years more. We didn't know it at the time, but Emily's health was silently deteriorating. The breast cancer diagnosis hit us like a truck at her annual exam. One day, we were making plans for an Alaskan cruise. The next, we were consulting oncologists about treatment options. Emily fought with every ounce of her being. She attacked the chemo and radiation regimens with the same ferocious determination she had once used to shield our marriage. For a while, it seemed like her strength and our love would will the cancer away. But life has a cruel way of reminding you that not all battles can be won through sheer force of will. After a 2-year fight, Emily's body began to lose the war from the inside. Those final months were some of the most emotionally excruciating of my life. Watching my once vibrant, strong-willed wife disintegrate into frailty and pain. Having to make the agonizing decisions about ending treatment. Trying to make peace with the idea of surviving her. Through it all, Emily never lost her sense of self or the fiery conviction that defined her. Even as she wasted away into a shadow of her former self, she was the one reassuring me that we would persevere. She drew on the same wellspring of strength that helped her sever ties with Jake all those years ago. In Emily's final moments, it was just the two of us. No family feeding the chaos, no dramas or distractions. Just my wife's piercing green eyes locked into mine, silently conveying a lifetime of love and unbending partnership.